let's talk about step 2 of your PSA, which is called assessing the bias and reliability of the document. So the idea here is that when you read a primary source, sometimes it can be more reliable or less reliable than other primary sources. They're all going to be biased in some way, even if it looks like every single aspect of it is true and authentic. There's going to be some element of bias. And as historians, your job is to read these sources kind of skeptically and critically and figure out what that bias is. That doesn't mean that you're going to say, this source is biased, I can't use it at all. You're just going to be using it in sort of a different way depending on what you determine that the bias and reliability of it is. So let's just look at through some of the examples. Basically, what you have here is a chart that asks you some specific questions about the source. And in your groups, here's a blank version of that chart, which you can copy and paste. And then as you type into these spaces here, will expand. You'll just be essentially answering the questions from this chart up here into a blank copy of it on your own. So that's what you're doing for step 2. So let's look at just a couple of the questions. If you're thinking about the sort of who and what of a document, thinking back to what you said about who it was about, or who wrote it, or who created it, and then what it was about. So if you're thinking about that, this person's identity, the creator of the source, you might want to think about, for example, what race is this person? Are they a poor person or a wealthy person? Do they have any religious affiliation? Is there anything that you know about them that might shape what they have to say by creating a document? And when I'm using the word document, I am meaning things like, it could be a diary or a letter, but it could also be a document or a source for the purposes of our course. Could be something like a painting or even like an object that someone created, like a clay pot, for example. So let's imagine that they've created a clay pot and they've drawn on the side of it. What specific ways do you think this person's identity, the creator of this pot, influenced what they drew on it, for example? What did they choose to emphasize in the drawings, and how did they depict people and places? Is there anything that they're drawing that they would have firsthand knowledge of, or they may be drawing something that their mother told them about? Just keep all of those things in mind, and when you're answering these questions about a specific source, answer literally every single one of these questions that you possibly can. Even if you're making inferences, just make it clear that that's what you're doing and say, it's probably true that they depicted things because they depicted things in X, Y, or Z way because of whatever you know about them. Then you'll do the same thing for all of these other questions. Answer as many of them as you possibly can based on the source at hand. So that's the first step. Here in this other bias and reliability issues, that's the space where you should put anything that doesn't fit up here, essentially. Don't do like N/A. You can always find something. All right, so then down here, this is asking you about how would you use this source now that you know that there are these biases. So you're going to think first about what specific research topic a historian might use this source for. Pick something really narrow, like don't say, for example, a historian could use this resource when thinking about the history of women and gender in the pre-modern world. That's the topic of our whole course. You need to get much more narrow than that. Don't even give me something as broad as like a chapter title. Go even more narrow. And then think about how a historian would have to be careful when using that source for whatever topic you listed up here. So going back to the example that I put way at the top up here about Susan B. Anthony's eulogy as a primary source, of course you wouldn't run across that in this class because it's a little outside of our time frame, but just imagine that that's what you were reading, for example. How would a historian using that eulogy to write, say, a biography of Susan B. Anthony have to be careful? And one reason that that person might have to be really careful is if you're using a eulogy, people tend to speak only about the good parts of a person's life. And so the author could have romanticized the story of Susan B. Anthony because her audience was a bunch of people who loved Susan B. Anthony. So that's one thing that you'd have to be careful about it if you were going to use it to, say, write a research topic, the topic being a biography of Susan B. Anthony. So you'll do that twice here, and you'll fill it in on the chart that you're just going to copy and paste. Here are just some notes that might help you. Think about how the source might be different if this were a different person who wrote it or created it. So if you're reading a diary, if and that diary is from a black woman living in Kenya, how might that diary have been different if a white man living in England had written it? And you can just kind of think about that in order to help you with some of these questions above. Um, for this part here, when you're thinking of different sources that it might be, or excuse me, different topics, research topics that the source might be useful for, um, think about the fact that you could use one source for about a million different topics. It's really hard to be wrong on this part. Just stick with topics that the source would actually be good for, not just things that are related really tangentially. That's something you should keep in mind. And this we've sort of talked about already. I'll leave it there for you to read. Just remember that every source you run into is going to have bias, but that doesn't mean that necessarily you should throw it out or anything. So that's step 2.